for generations. Third, a powerful lie has been quietly passed down through classrooms, churches, media, and culture itself, the lie that black people are somehow less than, broken, or cursed. It is a lie so carefully constructed that many never question where it came from or who benefits from it. Tonight, we begin by confronting that deception head-on. Louis Farrakhan rejects the idea of black inferiority at its core. He declares that black people are not cursed, not accidental, and not secondary in human history. Instead, he asserts that black people are the original people of the earth, the foundation from which all humanity emerged. This message is not about hatred or division. It is about truth, identity, and reclaiming what was deliberately taken away, self-worth. Ask yourself this: if a people are taught from birth that their appearance, history, and identity are inferior, how do they see themselves in the mirror? How do they treat one another? And how easily can they be controlled? Farrakhan's words challenge us to examine how deeply this lie has shaped the modern world, not only for black people, but for everyone living within systems built on superiority and inferiority. This story is not found in most textbooks. It is rarely discussed openly, and that is exactly why it matters. Because when false ideas go unchallenged for centuries, they become accepted as normal. Tonight's message invites you to pause, reflect, and question what you were taught about race, history, and human value. If you believe these conversations are important, help this message reach more people. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who is ready to think deeper. What you are about to hear may challenge long-held beliefs, but truth always does. Once the lie of inferiority is planted, it does not survive on its own. It must be protected, reinforced, and repeated until it feels natural. Farrakhan argues that this is exactly how white supremacy sustained itself over centuries, not only through force, but through far more subtle and lasting means. Long before chains and laws did their damage, ideas were already at work, shaping how people saw themselves and each other. Education became one of the most powerful tools. History was carefully framed so that greatness appeared to flow in one direction, while entire civilizations were reduced to footnotes or erased altogether. Children learned early whose achievements were worth remembering and whose were not. Over time, this selective memory did more than distort the past. It reshaped identity. When a people are never shown as builders, thinkers, or originators, they begin to assume they never were. That absence becomes a quiet lesson, repeated year after year, until it settles deep in the mind. Culture carried the message even further. Standards of beauty, intelligence, and success were consistently presented in one image, one tone, one set of features. Everything outside of that frame was subtly marked as less desirable. Farrakhan points out that this was not accidental. When people are taught to distance themselves from their own appearance, their own hair, their own natural expressions, they are being trained to reject themselves piece by piece. Self-rejection, once normalized, becomes a powerful form of control because it requires no external enforcement. The individual begins to police their own identity. Social systems then completed the cycle. Opportunities were structured in ways that rewarded conformity to the dominant image while punishing those who could not or would not fit it. Over time, inequality appeared not as a design flaw, but as a natural outcome. If one group consistently rises while another struggles, the story writes itself. Superiority on one side, failure on the other. The system no longer needs to announce its bias, because the results seem to confirm the narrative it created. What makes this process so effective is that it rarely announces itself as domination. It presents itself as normality, as tradition, as the way things simply are. Farrakhan emphasizes that this is why the damage runs so deep. People are not only told what to think, they are taught how to see. And once vision itself is altered, reality follows. A person who has been conditioned to see themselves as inferior does not need to be reminded of it. They feel it in how they move through the world, in what they expect from life, and in what they believe is possible. Yet this conditioning does not stop with one group. Farrakhan consistently links this false hierarchy to wider harm, explaining that any system built on superiority and inferiority eventually poisons everyone within it. Those placed at the top are trained to defend a position that was never earned, while those pushed below are taught to doubt their own worth. The result is a society fractured not by truth, but by illusion. By connecting identity, education, culture, and social structure into one continuous story, Farrakhan reveals that the lie of inferiority was never spontaneous. It was engineered, maintained, and passed down, generation after generation. And if it was constructed, it can also be dismantled. Understanding how the story was written is the first step toward refusing to live by its rules. Once a system succeeds in rewriting history and reshaping culture, its most lasting victory appears inside the mind. Farrakhan's message moves deeper here, beyond institutions and structures, into the quiet, personal space where identity is formed. He describes internalized racism not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience that subtly teaches black people to measure their value against a standard that was never meant to include them. From an early age, signals are sent about what is admired and what is merely tolerated. Beauty is consistently associated with features that reflect whiteness, while intelligence and success are portrayed through the same narrow lens. These messages do not arrive as direct commands. They arrive as images, expectations, and assumptions repeated so often that they begin to feel self-evident. Over time, comparison replaces self-recognition. The mirror becomes less a reflection and more a judgment. Farrakhan explains that this process does not require constant external pressure. Once the idea takes root, people begin to absorb it unconsciously. They question their own appearance, soften their natural expressions, or feel compelled to distance themselves from anything that might mark them as different. This is where the harm becomes deeply personal. The struggle is no longer only against a system, but against an internal voice shaped by years of conditioning. What makes this form of damage so powerful is its invisibility. A person may achieve success and still feel unworthy of it. They may receive admiration and yet doubt its sincerity. Farrakhan points out that when worth is defined by proximity to whiteness, self-esteem becomes fragile, always dependent on comparison rather than truth. The closer one appears to the dominant image, the more accepted they feel. The further away, the more they are taught to question themselves. This internal conflict spills outward. When people are trained to see themselves through a distorted lens, relationships suffer, community bonds weaken, competition replaces solidarity. Farrakhan argues that a divided mind often leads to divided people, where frustration and confusion turn inward rather than toward the false standards that created them. The result is not simply emotional pain, but a cycle that affects behavior, choices, and long-term outcomes. Yet within this diagnosis is an important realization. Internalized racism did not arise naturally. It was learned, and what is learned can be unlearned. Farrakhan's narrative does not ask people to adopt arrogance or reverse hierarchy. Instead, it calls for clarity. Recognizing inherent worth without needing approval from an external standard is not an act of defiance, but an act of healing. As the story unfolds, the emphasis shifts from blame to awareness. Farrakhan stresses that people shaped by this conditioning are not at fault for absorbing it. When an idea is presented as truth from every direction, resistance requires knowledge, context, and courage. Understanding how beauty, intelligence, and value were redefined over time allows individuals to separate who they are from what they were told to be. In this way, the speech connects seamlessly to the larger narrative already established. The lie of inferiority does not survive solely in history books or policies. It survives in thought patterns, habits, and expectations. Challenging it means more than rejecting false images. It means rebuilding the inner foundation on which confidence, dignity, and purpose stand. When that foundation is restored, the psychological harm begins to loosen its grip. An identity can finally be claimed on its own terms. As Farrakhan's argument unfolds, the story widens beyond a single community and reveals a broader pattern that connects many different peoples under the same historical shadow. The mechanisms that shaped Black identity, he explains, were not isolated or accidental. They were part of a larger colonial project that moved across continents, leaving behind fractured histories and rewritten identities wherever it settled. To understand the full scope of this damage, he turns attention to Hispanics, Native Americans, and other non-European peoples whose stories were altered in remarkably similar ways. Colonialism rarely announced itself as destruction. It arrived carrying promises of progress, order, and salvation. Yet beneath those promises was a systematic process of replacement. Indigenous names were exchanged for foreign ones. Languages spoken for generations were discouraged or erased, and belief systems rooted in land and ancestry were dismissed as backward. Farrakhan frames this not as cultural exchange, but as cultural displacement. When a people lose the words that once defined them, they also lose access to the memory of who they were. For many Hispanic communities, this process created layered identities that feel familiar yet strangely disconnected. Surnames trace back to distant lands. Languages point toward empires that once ruled rather than homelands that once thrived. And traditions carry fragments of older worlds now partially forgotten. Farrakhan suggests that this confusion is not a coincidence. It is the residue of conquest, where identity was reshaped to align with power rather than truth. Over time, what was imposed came to feel inherited, even when it erased deeper roots. The story of Native Americans reveals an even starker example. Entire civilizations were reduced to symbols, reservations, or historical footnotes, while their philosophies, knowledge systems, and social structures were dismissed or misunderstood. Farrakhan emphasizes that this erasure did not happen because these cultures lacked value, but because acknowledging their value would have challenged the moral foundation of conquest. It is easier to justify displacement when the displaced are portrayed as lesser or incomplete. What links these experiences to the earlier discussion of internalized inferiority is the psychological aftermath. When a people are taught that their original identity must be replaced in order to be accepted, survival begins to depend on adaptation rather than authenticity. Over generations, this adaptation can harden into belief. People come to defend the very narratives that diminished them, not because they are false, but because they have become familiar. Farrakhan's critique is careful to emphasize that this history affects more than memory. It shapes how communities see themselves in relation to one another. When different groups are taught to compete for acceptance within a hierarchy they did not design, division becomes almost inevitable. The original connection between peoples, forged through shared humanity and shared origin, fades behind labels imposed by colonial boundaries. Yet the purpose of revisiting this history is not to reopen old wounds for their own sake. Farrakhan presents it as a necessary step toward coherence. Understanding how names, languages, and beliefs were replaced allows people to see that feelings of disconnection did not arise from personal failure, but from historical disruption. The loss of identity was not natural. It was engineered. By linking the experiences of Black people, Hispanics, Native Americans, and other non-European communities, the narrative gains a deeper unity. The same forces that promoted inferiority in one group relied on erasure in another. Different methods, same outcome. A world reordered to benefit a narrow center of power. In this broader context, reclaiming identity becomes an act of restoration rather than rebellion. It is about remembering what existed before the interruption and recognizing that dignity does not originate from imposed labels. As the story continues, this understanding sets the stage for a more honest reckoning with history, one that allows people to reconnect not only with their past, but with one another. As the narrative deepens, Farrakhan turns to one of the most influential forces shaping belief and identity, religion. He does not approach it as an outsider attacking faith, but as a critic examining how sacred ideas were reshaped to serve earthly power. In doing so, he connects this thread seamlessly to the earlier themes of erased history, distorted identity, and internalized inferiority. Religion, he argues, did not stand apart from colonial systems. It was often woven directly into them. Christianity, in its original spiritual message, speaks of compassion, humility, and justice. Yet Farrakhan contends that when it traveled alongside conquest, it was altered in presentation and purpose. The faith that should have affirmed human dignity was instead used to redefine it. Central to this transformation was imagery. Over time, the dominant image of Jesus became unmistakably white, not as a neutral artistic choice, but as a symbolic anchor, when the figure representing ultimate goodness, purity, and divine authority is consistently portrayed in one racial form. It quietly sends a message about who reflects those qualities and who does not. This message, Farrakhan explains, does not need to be spoken aloud to be absorbed. It settles into the subconscious through repetition. Children grow up seeing holiness associated with whiteness, while their own reflection appears absent from the highest moral ideal. The result is not simply theological confusion, but psychological distance. If goodness looks nothing like you, how do you learn to see goodness within yourself? What makes this dynamic especially powerful is its emotional weight. Faith shapes how people understand suffering, hope, and purpose. When spiritual narratives are presented through a narrow lens, they influence not only belief, but self-perception. Farrakhan argues that this contributed to a subtle moral hierarchy, where closeness to whiteness appeared synonymous with closeness to virtue. Over generations, this association blurred the line between faith and identity, making it difficult to separate spiritual truth from cultural conditioning. Importantly, Farrakhan is careful to distinguish between reverence for Jesus and criticism of how his image was used. His argument is not against belief, but against manipulation. He suggests that when religion becomes a tool of dominance, it loses its capacity to liberate. Instead of guiding people toward higher understanding, it reinforces the same systems of superiority and inferiority already embedded in society. This distortion also affected relationships between communities. Those taught to see themselves as closer to divine favor often felt justified in judging or dismissing others. Meanwhile, those taught to see themselves as spiritually lacking internalized shame that had nothing to do with their actions or character. The moral damage mirrored the historical and cultural damage already described, completing a cycle in which identity, history, and faith all pointed toward the same false conclusion. Yet Farrakhan's purpose is not to strip meaning from religion, but to return meaning to it. By questioning how sacred symbols were framed, he invites listeners to separate faith from ideology. If God represents goodness beyond human boundaries, then no single image can claim ownership of virtue. In that realization lies the possibility of spiritual healing, not just social correction. Within the broader story, this critique reinforces a consistent message. The lie of inferiority was not sustained by one institution alone. It required reinforcement from history, culture, education, and even spirituality. Each element echoed the others, creating a worldview that felt complete and unquestionable. By examining religion honestly, Farrakhan removes another pillar supporting that illusion. As the narrative moves forward, this moment becomes a turning point. It challenges listeners to ask whether their beliefs were inherited freely or shaped deliberately. And in that question, the story opens space for faith to exist without hierarchy, identity without shame, and goodness without a prescribed color. As the story reaches this point, Farrakhan shifts from exposing distortion to rebuilding truth, grounding his argument not only in memory or belief, but in evidence drawn from science and history. After tracing how identity was reshaped through culture, religion, and power, he turns to genetics and anthropology as witnesses that stand outside ideology. These disciplines, he argues, quietly affirm what was long denied: humanity's shared origin in Africa and the African foundations of civilization itself. Rather than presenting this as an abstract theory, Farrakhan frames it as a revelation hidden in plain sight. Genetics tells a simple story about human variation. Traits associated with lighter skin and eyes are not the starting point of humanity, but later developments. Diversity did not emerge from uniformity. It emerged from an original source rich in variation. Anthropology echoes this conclusion. The earliest human remains, the oldest tools, and the first signs of organized society consistently trace back to Africa. These findings do not elevate one group to dominate another. They dissolve the illusion that hierarchy was ever natural. Within the broader narrative, this moment serves a crucial purpose. Earlier, Farrakhan described how history was rewritten to minimize or erase non-European contributions. Now he demonstrates that this erasure required ignoring overwhelming evidence. Civilization did not suddenly appear in isolation. Knowledge traveled. Mathematics, medicine, architecture, and philosophy moved outward from earlier centers of human development. Greece, often portrayed as the cradle of Western civilization, did not arise in a vacuum. It inherited and adapted ideas that had already existed for centuries. Farrakhan emphasizes that recognizing Africa as the starting point does not diminish anyone's humanity. Instead, it reconnects humanity to a shared beginning. When people understand that all human families branch from the same root, the logic of superiority collapses. Difference becomes variation, not division. Skin tone becomes adaptation, not value. In this light, the lie of inferiority appears not only cruel, but unnecessary. This scientific perspective also reframes identity. If all people descend from African ancestors, then the attempt to distance oneself from that origin is a rejection of one's own history. Farrakhan suggests that much of the confusion surrounding race stems from this denial. When societies build identity on separation rather than connection, fear replaces understanding. Science, however, offers a quiet correction. It does not argue emotionally. It simply points back to origins. What makes this part of the story especially powerful is how it aligns with everything that came before. Cultural conditioning taught people to associate worth with appearance. Religion reinforced that message through selective imagery. History textbooks narrowed the scope of human achievement. Genetics and anthropology, by contrast, expand it again. They restore scale. They remind humanity that the story is older, broader, and more interconnected than modern narratives suggest. Farrakhan's use of science is not meant to replace faith or culture, but to balance them. He presents knowledge as a tool of restoration, capable of dismantling myths without creating new ones. By anchoring identity in shared ancestry rather than imposed hierarchy, he redirects the conversation away from competition and toward responsibility. If humanity began together, then the future must be built together as well. In the flow of the narrative, this moment feels like a clearing after a long journey through distortion. The lies that once seemed solid begin to lose their weight. Inferiority no longer has a foundation to stand on. Superiority loses its justification. What remains is a more honest understanding of human origin, one that does not threaten identity, but strengthens it. By reconnecting civilization to Africa and humanity to a single lineage, Farrakhan completes a crucial arc in the story. The past, once fractured by ideology, begins to make sense again. And with that clarity comes the possibility of moving forward without the burden of false divisions, guided instead by truth, evidence, and a shared human beginning. As Farrakhan brings his message to a close, the focus turns from exposure to transformation. After tracing how false ideas were constructed, repeated, and internalized, he offers a challenge that is both demanding and hopeful, a mental and philosophical reorientation. The problem, he argues, is not only what societies have done, but how they have learned to think. Systems of dominance survive because they shape perception, convincing people that hierarchy is normal and division is inevitable. To move forward, That way of thinking must be replaced at its root. This reorientation begins with rejecting the illusion of superiority and inferiority altogether. Farrakhan does not argue for reversing roles or creating new hierarchies. Instead, he insists that the very framework is flawed. When one group is taught to see itself as naturally above others, and another is taught to see itself as less than, both are trapped by the same lie. One is burdened with fear of losing status, the other with doubt about its own worth. Neither is free. True progress, he suggests, requires abandoning this false scale entirely. At the heart of his conclusion is a call to shared humanity. Beneath differences of appearance, culture, or background lies a common origin and a common responsibility. Recognizing this does not erase history or ignore injustice. It provides the clarity needed to address them honestly. When people see one another as fully human rather than as symbols or categories, respect becomes possible, and accountability gains meaning. Without that shift, even well-intended reforms remain superficial. Farrakhan emphasizes that this change starts in the mind before it can appear in institutions. Laws can be rewritten, and policies can be adjusted. But if the underlying philosophy remains unchanged, old patterns will re-emerge in new forms. A renewed way of thinking must teach people to question inherited assumptions, to examine where their beliefs came from, and to decide whether those beliefs serve truth or simply preserve comfort. This vision is not limited to one community. It speaks to everyone shaped by a world divided into ranks of value. Farrakhan's final appeal is for courage, the courage to unlearn, to listen, and to imagine a society where dignity is not assigned by category but recognized as inherent. Such a shift does not happen overnight, but it begins with awareness and grows through deliberate choice. As this story comes to an end, its central message becomes clear. The lies that once defined identity do not have to define the future. A different path is possible, one grounded in truth, responsibility, and mutual recognition. That path asks more of us, but it also offers more in return. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and stay with this message until the end. If this conversation resonated with you and you believe these ideas deserve a wider audience, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep thoughtful discussions alive and ensures that voices challenging long-held myths continue to be heard.